All right.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're more than delighted to have at today's presentation on professional journeys, Dr. RaShall Brackney. And Dr. Brackney has a number of linkages to Carnegie Mellon. For one thing, she got her academic degrees both at Dietrich College, which I guess at the time was called College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and at the Heinz College. So she's a proud alum. Um, she also is a fellow at the CMU Washington Semester Program. And maybe she'll mention this a little bit, but I think she's teaching a course maybe this coming fall, or she'll tell us. Dr. Brackney has 30 years of experience with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Chief of Police, Bureau of Police, and she's been the chief of police at George Washington University. As a law enforcement professional, she's been responsible for overseeing operations that include a wide range of responsibilities, from preparing uniform crime reports to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to receiving CALIA accreditation, which is the main accrediting body for agencies of law enforcement, which includes public safety agencies and training agencies and communications, public safety agencies on campuses and elsewhere. She is now, as I mentioned, the chief of police at Charlottesville, Virginia, where she oversees operations that span from the normal day-to-day to the SWAT teams to the hostage negotiations. Those are the ones we want to hear about. And but in any case, Dr. RaShall, we're very happy to have you here. We're honored. And I think I'll turn the floor over to you, unless, Al, you want people to go around the room quickly and say hello and who they are.
I think we'll skip intros. We have 47 people on the call today, so that would eat up a lot of time. But just a couple of just a couple of house rules before we get started. We will open this up for a question and answer session after Chief Brackney gives her remarks. So if you would like to ask your question live, please use the raise hand function. Otherwise, feel free to send me a direct message in the chat and I will relay that question anonymously for you. So that said, Chief Brackney, over to you.
So thank you and welcome. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity. I see some of my former students. I see Petey and Sarah and Christina just email or hit me in the chat, but Dr. Rousseau, you know, I'm a huge fan from afar. I hope I do not embarrass you. Serious, like stalking kind of fan between you and Linda Babcock. So forgive me along the way. But thank you again for the opportunity and the opportunity to share my journey. I do have to say, I'm going to embarrass Petey, but he has been an advocate of pushing for me to be involved in the campus community in a very real and intentional way, and he does so every single time. So my friends and family, the Carnegie Mellon Black Alumni Association, who is always involved in these incidents, IPS, and the Washington Semester Program, thank you for the opportunity to engage and to share my journey. So traditionally, when we think about journeys, we consider the ways in which our experiences grow us. They expand our lens, they create memories that are imprinted and woven into our DNA. They become our lived experiences. They become experiences that allow us to connect to and with others. And for me, more often than not, though, I felt disconnected. I felt like an outsider. In fact, I can't recall a phase or a stage in my life when I immediately felt welcome or belonging in a space. I mean, authentically, belonging and welcome in a community. At an early age, especially in Pittsburgh, I knew I was different. At first, I simply felt different. But the world has a cruel way of ensuring that you understand you are different. They remind you of every aspect of you being an other, an outsider. I'm a female, I'm Black, I'm multi-ethnic, I grew up poor in the inner city. And at one point, I was a single mother. I am first gen. And all of these attributes, they definitely describe me and continually are weaponized against me. And for those who look like me, they are attributes that the community will leverage against you to disconnect you, to create barriers, and leave you feeling as though you don't belong and you don't have a journey. I was born in the city of Pittsburgh, more specifically, Homewood, the daughter of a white man and a Black woman, one of 6 children. My brother was the oldest, followed by 5 sisters. As being one of 6 children, I should say that it was my poor brother that was followed by 5 girls, but it's probably my poor mother, because by the age of 21, she had 4 children, all under the age of 4. We lived in my grandmother's house. We were poor, but we were proud. 6 people in 4 rooms. I attended a Catholic school in Homewood from kindergarten through 8th grade. You would think that any child would feel as though they belonged was in their own family or in their school, particularly a private Christian institution. But unfortunately, those are the places and spaces where I felt my first doses of being an other. Both of my parents were Catholic, and we attended church religiously. Sunday mornings, Wednesday, Catholic schools, you go every day. And right now we are in Lent, so do not go to hell just because you had meat on Friday, folks. We would think, though, that you would belong in those spaces. In spite of our beliefs and our adherence to our faith and sacraments, my parents could not be married in the Catholic Church in 1961. It was illegal for interracial couples to marry. In spite of that, and it's not until 1967 that we have Virginia B. Loving. So to avoid living under the label of sin, my parents married a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia. And it was at that moment more others were created for me: race and familial status. I felt disconnected. My brothers and sisters and I were ostracized, often labeled, calling words like bastards, mutts, mixed breeds. My paternal grandmother hurled racial epithets, barred us from entering her home, and disowned my father. In school, we were teased and I was bullied. I escaped through books and was a ferocious reader. I became extremely introverted and shy. That escape, though, set me on my pathway to CMU. In my senior year, like most students, I scoured old school style college brochures, not swiping left or right, but poring over pages. I looked at Harvard and Princeton and Yale, the Air Force Academy, West Point, and Carnegie Mellon, where I was accepted in all. Although I was accepted into an Ivy League school, and that was exhilarating, financially, they were far beyond my reach. So I stayed locally. I stayed at Carnegie Mellon. And happily, I packed up my items and headed to Mudge Hall. I hung out in Skibo. I chilled on the Gray Matter, Spirit House events. There was buggy, there was football, and I was a D-Force doll for those of us who are from the 1980s. My freshman year, my sophomore year, my junior year, and the first semester of my senior year, they flew by. As a first-gen student, a term not bantered about in the early 80s, I was determined to succeed. You see, my father never progressed beyond the 6th grade. He dropped out of school to work in the local steel mills. He lacked a formal education. Although he did, he was the most intelligent and smartest man I knew. My mother, she had a GED, staying home to raise those 6 children before entering into the workforce. My parents, they valued education. And my dad would often elevate our conversation to the New York Times crossword level style, forcing me to grab a dictionary and look it up. There was no Google, no Alexa, no iPhone to ask. And in many families, There was this dream of escaping poverty through education, and it often places an undue burden on first-gen children to succeed. You see, your success represents their success. However, by the spring semester of my senior year, my journey at Carnegie Mellon came to a screeching halt as bills came due. My finances were depleted, school debt was mounting, no student loans or Pell Grants or Parent Plus funds were available. Financial aid from Carnegie Mellon was non-existent. My scholarships would cover room and board, but as we all know, that does not cover the real cost of an education. And with no pathway forward, I withdrew. Shortly after leaving CMU, and in the hopes of steady employment, I entered the policing profession more than 37 years ago. Affirmative action hiring practice had been implemented in the city of Pittsburgh due to the intentional exclusion of qualified minority candidates from the hiring pools, which is ironic, as policing is often defined as a fraternal association. But I was quickly hired. My first day in the academy, I was met with ridicule by several of my male recruits, both Black and white. I was young and a minority, a female. I was an outsider. I was another. One recruit dubbed me bubblegum due to my age, and another stated, "You're young, you're small, you're a woman. These streets are tough, and you've never done anything in these streets except maybe cross one." Insider secret. 37 years later, I'm still in this profession. I've rose to the ranks of the Pittsburgh Police Department, was the former chief of police of George Washington University. I've operated and commanded SWAT teams, conducted hostage rescue efforts. I've graduated from the FBI National Academy, the Secret Service Specialized Dignitary Protections, and I am your current chief of police in Charlottesville Police Department. As for my doubters, those haters, they failed. So why did they fail? I believe it's because of othering. They were insecure in their journeys, so they wanted to disrupt mine. But I made it through. In fact, I excelled. However, although I was excelling in my career, I felt inadequate, ashamed, a fraud. Because in reality, regardless of my credits and my studies at CMU, ultimately, I was simply a high school graduate. And in the world of educational elitism, an advanced degree is another way in which we discount, discard, and devalue others. So in the late 80s and 90s, I started a letter writing campaign to return to school. I was financially stable, single, no children. I worked evenings, I worked nights, so attending classes would be easily integrated in my work schedule. Excited about the possibilities, I just knew CMU would gladly welcome back a student who could also expand their demographics and their diversity. Think about it. I was a returning student. Code word for a bit older or mature. Once again, I was going to be another. But even educational institutions can create either intentional or unintentional barriers to your entry and your success. My letters fell on deaf ears, and I was not admitted back into the program until 2007. I received an email from Dr. Jay Devine, who is iconic on CMU's campus in his own right. And the subject line simply read, "Unfinished business." The email suggested we meet in his Baker Hall office, the dungeon at the time, and suggested in my thoughts that he had also said that he had followed my career for more than 20 years. So when we met, the rest is history. He helped me return to Carnegie Mellon. He fought on my behalf. And at some point, Mark, we're going to talk about this because you were one of my letter writing campaign people. Well, the rest is history. I completed my requirements for my BS in 2009, more than 29 years after I started that journey. and my master's in public management in 2011. But then why stop there? I entered my PhD program in May of 2014, and by March of 2017, I had successfully defended a PhD and doctorate program in 2 years and 9 months. All right, but I digress. My career in Pittsburgh was coming to an end, and it was an exciting career. But was it enough? In January of 2018, I was the chief of police for George Washington University. My husband, a tenured professor at George Mason University, and our daughter, Ricky, was completing her master's in clinical mental health counseling. We were enjoying a halcyon days, as we like to say it, and we thought more likely a halcyon life. For the first time in a long time, I felt as though I belonged, but I also felt unsettled as the nation was publicly grappling with rising levels of violence, extremism, nationalism, and American exceptionalism. And for me, that manifestation was no more evident than at Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life shooting, Charlottesville at the Unite the Right rally, and most recently now, the Capitol insurrection, where the loss of life has been stoked by hate and the desire to dominate and divide. Currently, more than 893 formal groups, hate groups, call the U.S. home. They believe their land, their way of life, their privilege, their identity is being pushed aside by those less worthy. Across the nation, those who espouse division, they've been emboldened by national leaders who relish the spotlight of fringe and extremism. They no longer remain hidden. Supporters now wrap themselves in Confederate flags. They display swastikas on their garments, and they are warmed by the tiki torches that they take to the streets, chanting that Jews will not replace us. And in 2018, a precursor to January of 26, that's exactly what I walked into Charlottesville, a place where every other that could be used to define or describe me was and is constantly assailed, all in an effort to cling to the last vestiges of hate, an attempt to derail the reckoning which the foreboding lay on the horizon. But I had to stay the course, and I have taken a stance against those who peddle hate and intolerance. I've taken a stance against New York-style racial profiling tactics against stop and frisk, the death penalty, the criminalization of poverty, mental health, unfair and unjust sentencing practices, the proliferation of assault weapons in our communities, and against police violence. Our journeys demand that it demands that I not be weaponized against Black and brown communities. It demands we not be weaponized against each other. And our commitment to do so must extend to all vulnerable communities. My journey mandates that I not support the weaponizing of law enforcement to separate families seeking asylum or to protect US borders from phantom external threats, that I not be weaponized against those protesting disproportionate minority contacts or the shooting of unarmed Black and brown men, Black and brown women, and indigenous populations. But CMU, this job is not mine or mine alone. We can no longer embrace the status quo. Our conscious moral leadership recognizes injustices. We recognize failures, we own it, and then we act on it. And as dispiriting as these world events may seem, our humanity has made tremendous progress towards tolerance, inclusion, and equity. US and globally, as white supremacy and anti-Black violence permeates the fabric of our society, I believe today's cultural terrain presents that opportunity to focus our attention on how the nation's history of slavery and violent territorial expansion, racial and economic disparities, as well as gender discrimination and violence have worked to entrench white supremacy and white chauvinism in our political, social, economic, and educational institutions. I'm concerned that rhetoric of diversity, equity, inclusion, and academic freedom risks becoming a managerial response to these entrenched social problems, providing cover and a balm to our self-inflicted wounds so that our journeys are crippled. CMU, we live in a period of dramatic social change. It's unprecedented. The ability to change is unprecedented. Whether we continue to march towards a more just society, while we tame our baser impulses, while we steady our fears, and how we do that depends on us. Our stories here, our journeys, they narrow our gap. They connect us when we feel disconnected. Our journeys inspire each other. However, they're not merely meant to inspire, not in this moment or merely in this place. As leaders, what are you willing to do to leverage your personal and collective agency to broaden your pathway and the pathway of others? As members of not-for-profits or NGOs, how will you leverage your alliances to make a difference? Not difference fueled by bottom lines, 2-year funding cycles, your endowed chairs, or your grants, but by the power of your economies. As politicians and members of faith-based communities, are you willing to lead with integrity of heart, boldly confronting long-standing institutional inequities that alienate and separate? How will you protest the injustices, the inequities, and the othering that continues to disconnect and divide our most vulnerable populations? As students, advocates, activists, and alum, what does your journey and protest look like when you're challenging those who trade in fear and isolation? How will you inspire? I will remind some of my students of this quote from Dr. Jonathan White of Penn State. He's an activist, he's a scholar, and he's a friend. He once remarked that your protest is your most powerful expression of powerlessness. Students, fellows, faculty, staff, administrators, donors, board of trustees, endowed chairs, alumni, provosts, presidents, you hold power. CMU IPS specifically, WPS, you can shape and recontour the narrative of the nation through your courageous and intentional moral journey. Our privilege, our positions, our access, they empower us. We can dismantle, reshape, contour, and redefine our infectious legacy of destruction. We can take a knee, a different knee, not one suffocating the life out of George Floyd or other Black men dying at the hands of police for the crime of being Black. Take a knee to defy systems that have no regard for my Black husband, my Black brother-in-law, my Black father-in-law, my Black brother, nephew, cousins, friends, and brothers. Kneel in full support of the movement to take the life out of police brutality, police violence, police death. My journey has filled me with moments of joy, sadness, and grief, terror, disappointment, satisfaction, and pride. My pathway, like many, has been difficult yet gratifying. It has allowed me to move beyond my expectations, and most certainly so many others. But as I see it, my journey, my unfinished business, it has yet to be revealed. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you so very, very much. That's an extraordinary and inspiring story that you have told. I have a couple questions, if so, all right, to ask. They're sort of, well, two of them, but they're sort of different. Were you chief of police when the Charlottesville killings occurred? And if so, could you describe the community reaction and so forth? And then as a more general question, do you get much or a lot of resistance from from police officers with regard to who may well be white, with regard to some of the things that you feel so deeply about?
So thank you. No, I was not the chief of police in August of 2017. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was brought in as a result of the events that had occurred here. And this community, as the nation is still reeling from the trauma that has occurred here. It is very raw. And the events of January 16 just really ripped the scab off of a community that is trying to find its way as well. And part of that is a challenge because FBI reports have come out that said supremacists, those groups, those white nationalist militia groups, have long infiltrated law enforcement and policing. Yes. So when we talk about pushback, I am a Black female woman from the South living below the Mason-Dixie line, where the Lee statue is right outside of my office, basically, and Confederate flags fly that say heritage, not hate. I'm going to ask you to answer your own question about whether I get pushback or not. And Ethan, I want a Mudge tote bag. I see that in the chat.
So we'll open it up. Ali, you may see the questions. I cannot.
Absolutely. So can we talk a little bit about whether or not social media surveillance is protected under the Fourth Amendment? And if so, to what extent? And then also, is America's surveillance of social media websites enough to prevent domestic terrorism?
So thank you. Those are really good questions. I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV, but my answer is this. Fourth Amendment, so surveillance first indicates that it is secret and it's occurring undercover. When we're talking about surveillance of your social media, having access to what is already out in the public sphere, there's really no expectation of privacy. Now, that's just not a blanketed statement. There are some expectations that you have. If you DM or IM each other, you've set up private group chats or private social media, and then I try and infiltrate those. That's very different versus these open source systems in which people very happily post all of the things that they're interested in doing and how they're going to do it. Thank you for that. That makes my job a whole lot easier. And is it enough? I think it's not enough if it's only going to land in the hands of law enforcement. In order to have a safe community, there has to be a co-production of public safety in which when you see these things occurring, you hear about them, particularly our younger students and generation who are on every social media platform. When you hear about them, that's often how we are notified. A lot of stuff used to come out of 4chan, 8chan, and all these other spaces, Reddit, and they've been given to law enforcement when people believe their communities are at jeopardy.
Thank you. We're going to take a question live from Ethan Rabb, who looks like he's joining us from our Washington semester offices. Ethan.
Yes, hi, I actually am. I'm the only one in the office right now. I do have policy forum later. But first and foremost, thank you so much for being here, Chief Brackney. It means the world. And I kind of wanted to ask like a kind of antithesis question to what Professor Kamlet said. He was asking about pushback. I wanted to know to what extent your views have reach and are endorsed by people within your field.
So if nothing else, this moment, as I call it, we are at a reckoning and recognizing moment which we now have to rectify what is going on, right? So if nothing else, police chiefs are going to get on board, even if they weren't on board before, because there's such scrutiny and level of accountability. And now society is demanding it. You know, it is demanding a response. And it is saying that we give you your legal and moral authority, so you need to listen to us, or we will revoke that contract that we have with you. And that contract is coming as with people saying they want to renegotiate in the forms of language like defund or demilitarize or to abolish. So even if they were resistant at first, I think they're hearing it. A joke I have here is, how far has it been able to penetrate? I will not tell you the name of the person, but people were so emboldened when I arrived here that a high-ranking official in my agency, when they first met me, one of his responses was, And I don't do Southern accents well, and it's not an offense, as a city girl from the hood. But he was like, listen, lady, I vote Republican and I don't drink no fucking, darn pumpkin lattes. Am I allowed to say that? Can you
are.
read that out, Allie? I don't want any FCC problems. But here's what I can say. After spending time and really realizing that the work goes deep, I just handed him a Starbucks the other day. What flavor? Pumpkin latte. So you can have an impact, but you've got to leave people in place long enough to dismantle systems. And we don't often do that in an instant society. We want an immediate response for something that's been in place for 400 years. 400. And then I see also too, thank you, Professor Lastman, for putting me on to John Edgar Wyman. I see he's in there. And hey, Emil.
Thank you. We are all adults here, Chief Brackney. So
I know, what? I'm not trying to get in trouble. I'll get censored
it's okay.
like some politician.
No worries at all. We have a question from Denise Rousseau, who wants to know what your dissertation was about and what book would you like to write?
Okay, so first, so Denise, thank you. I am currently starting a book that I have titled The Bruising of America, When Black, White, and Blue Collide. So is what I'm working on, and talking about how these spaces and what happens when they all there and the type of trauma that it occurs as a bruise. You know, that bruise will heal, but what happens below the surface, the damage that's done, and looking at it through a variety of lenses, myself as a woman, as a minority, the experiences that I've had, but also sitting in this place and space as well. And my dissertation is on resiliency and adaptive choices for African-American males in violent communities and how they respond to community violence. And what I was looking at was a lot of ways that society calls maladaptive may actually be very pro-social and adaptive in violent communities. And if we can then figure out a way so that those same characteristics and traits in which a person learns to survive in communities where trauma and violence is occurring, what could that be for that person in a healthy, thriving environment? Or maybe do we change society's way of what they call maladaptive? So that's a lot of what I looked at.
Perfect, thank you. We're going to take another question live from Christina.
Hello, Dr. Brackney. Oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. I was a student with Dr. Brackney 2 years ago with Washington Semester Program, and she literally changed my life with the class that she taught me, Shading of Democracy and the relationship between race and politics. And personally, like, I have to say, you know, that class really started a lot of the conversations that I needed to have, like at home with, you know, people that are much more personal and harder to reach when you're not, you know, like constantly faced with like the truths of reality right now. And it is currently, you know, really frustrating as a student and someone who often feels like they don't have any power to, you know, keep having these conversations. You know, I've only been having them since your class, which is, you know, such a short amount of time compared to how much, you know, everyone should be talking about this. So I'm just curious if you can give us insight on, do you think we're being productive in that sense? And what do you think we can do as students? Like, if the way that we're talking isn't productive now, like what can we do to be more productive to actually, you know, make some change at home?
So thank you for that. It is so good to see you all smiling faces. These really were the young adults that encouraged me and pushed me also. So it wasn't just a one-way push. It was very much back and forth. So what do? You know, I tell people there are some really clear things that you can do. One, create one or identify one thing that you're passionate about. One thing. Don't try and take over the entire world, right? Take one thing that you're passionate about. And then do two things with that. Create allies and alliances. They're very different to help you move that forward. Allies are the persons who you then will align yourself with around a common cause. But those alliances are those people who say, I'm willing to put my money, my resources, my time, my body behind that issue and work with you towards it. This is really difficult work to do solo, but it does often take, single heroic courage to move these issues forward. It normally takes somebody doing it first, but you all can create your cohorts to help support you. When you see someone whose vision and value align, take one thing and what does that look like? Does that think about maybe donating your time at the local neighborhood legal justice aid center, where you might have resources, or your abilities to write or your abilities to research can be used in a very different way. Your social media is powerful. My first group is the group that you all helped me get my Twitter account together, right? If you remember that. And I was asking you how to tweet something, right? Now I think I'm just too cute. So use those resources that come naturally to you and work to your strength. Take on something you're passionate about. And then here, I'm in 37 years of profession. I'm still as excited about those issues because they're authentically things that mean something to me.
Thank you. We have a great question in the chat. Excuse me. What is your self-care routine? How do you stay positive each day when faced with internal pushback?
Yeah, so self-care routine. What is that? So it's been a more difficult, here in Charlottesville, because this has been a very heavy lift and a steady lift. As you can imagine, every single day, Charlottesville is mentioned nationally and internationally in the news. Every day, there isn't a single day when Charlottesville is not mentioned and what that means. So prior to coming here, I used to run a lot. I ran with Black Girls Run. More than 25 years ago, I stopped eating meat and poultry and all those other things, and a very healthy diet. I always have some water in my hand. I am very spiritual and believe in faith. I know most people don't, but that's how things come to life. You start believing into something that you can't see and you invest in it. And then, I rely heavily on my family and my friends, very small cohort of friends. And since my daughter now is an actual clinical mental health therapist, I'm going to start calling her and getting some free therapy because I'm paying her student loans right now. She needs to get up off some of that money.
That seems fair.
And Bill, I see you came in.
So we are going to go to Alex O next, who has his hand raised in the.
Yep. Hi, Dr. Brackney. Thank you so much for coming today. It's been pretty incredible to hear about your journey so far. So my question kind of revolves around your experience when it comes to the adoption of different technologies within the police force to help aid their efforts. We've seen the need to kind of approach with caution, especially as an example, when we look at kind of policing predictive technology, only exacerbating the racial bias that exists in the police force. So my question is, how can the police force best incorporate emerging technologies such as facial recognition software and biometric data collection in general in an ethical and effective way?
So thank you, Alex, for that. I actually was on a panel with Carnegie Mellon about 3 months ago, it was over the summer, on ethical IA and policing and what we could do. And part of my concern is in this current moment when there's such a push to defund that somehow agencies may think they only have one or two options, right? That you either have the option of moving towards a co-production of public safety in which you and the communities really define what public safety looks like and you work together on that, because you're going to reduce staff or reduce funding and things of that nature. So we're going to need resource multipliers like the community to help keep us safe. My concern is for those agencies who may not be thinking about it in that way, will there be a more heavily reliant population or community on technology, like not just AI, facial recognition, biometrics, data collection, license plate surveillance, vans that can go by and x-ray you and see what's inside, drones, unmanned aerial devices. Will there be a push to replace human resources with technology because they're shorter? They're less expensive. They have a longer lifespan. They don't complain. They don't call off sick. They don't have a union that gets in the way of anything. Will people then start to default to those type of technologies? And when that starts to occur, who are those persons who then are damaged most by them? Wealthy, rich people will always be able to afford protections and privacy through gated communities. They live further away in terms of land mass. They're not in these very densely populated urban communities. And typically, if they feel like there is a right that's been violated, they can hire an attorney to sue you, hit you with an injunction to stop whatever's going on. That's not going to happen in your poorer communities. That's not going to happen in your Black and brown communities. That's not going to happen in those other places. So I am concerned. This may be an area where you really push your legislators to restrict the type of surveillance technology that can be used. Because in some ways, under your 4th Amendment and 14th Amendments, you're expecting some expectation of privacy or due process. Those things are often taken away when you introduce surveillance technology. And we also know that the software technology, especially around facial recognition, is so heavily flawed and is more likely to misidentify a person of color or a woman than it is someone who is white appearing. So there are all these issues around even the ethical coding and data collection and input. And then who holds the data, who has access to the data, and how transparent are we willing to be with that data? I hope that answered your question, Alexa.
Thank you. We're going to go to Emil's question in the chat. He asks, because the House just passed a police reform bill, what are your top 5 recommendations for police reform? How can or should each of us, and how can or should companies help to push police reform?
So the first thing I would say is, 1, use the language that it's appropriate. We don't want to reform policing. That's not what we want to do. We don't want to reimagine it. I'm doing a panel on Monday where they're asking me to reimagine it. You cannot reform a system that is diseased, right? When we think about cancer, we don't say, let's see how we can reform, cancer. We want to eradicate it. So the top priorities for me are to look at those systems, Emil, that give us the type of power and influence, not only around force, because we think that the legislator in the George Floyd, the passing of it in the House, which is going to have a hard time in the Senate passing. When we think about what we're asking of individuals to do, is the bill going to get us the desired outcome? Is the legislation going to get us the desired outcome? Or will it be the way in which it's implemented that gives us the desired outcome? So for all the social and decision scientists in the crowd, right? We think of this as a logic model. What are those inputs and activities that are going to get us the desired outcomes? We already have laws on the books that say, you know what? Don't put your knee on somebody's neck and kill them. We already got that. Right? We already have laws on the books that talk about things that you shouldn't do. Now, if I was talking about reconstructing and demolishing for all you engineers out there, how do you tear down a system and then create or imagine a new system of justice? Because even reimagining it often tamps back to a system that we know, and then we try and spin off of that and create ones. So my top priorities would be this: standardize accreditation and training across the nation. If I have to have a certain level or threshold to be a doctor, to be an accountant, to be a therapist, to be a journey person, either as an electrician or a plumber, and that standard goes across the state, then that should be the standard for policing if we're calling this an actual profession. So that would be that. Standardized training, standardized entry into it. Currently, in most places, you only need to be 18 years of age, have a driver's license, 18 driver's license, and often no no felony convictions, right? I mean, that barely gets you married in most states. So, and we're using that as a benchmark for that. I would also have a national standards and review on what does the actual training look like. Every training looks very differently. We all say that we have use of force training, but there's no standardization. There's no seal of approvals or rankings that says, you know, this is A training, B training, D training, and things of that nature. It just doesn't happen. So I would look at the standardization. And then lastly, creating, even if necessary, a poll or a rating, just like we have for the Bar Association that says highly qualified, barely recommended, you know, take back even their like mall security certificate. I mean, like, we need to have the same kind of ratings that says that a person is highly qualified to be in those spaces, and they become your pool of candidates that you can hire from. And lastly, anybody can start a police department. Anybody. There's no standards. They say, hey, we can afford one, we want one, we can create them. There should be standards to either create or maintain your certification as a police department. I think those are all things that are should be on the table, and most of them are not even in that bill.
Thanks. We're going to go to a question in the chat and then go back to Ethan. The question in the chat says, for those of us just starting our journeys and trying to bring our communities along with us, which peer-reviewed materials would you suggest for background primers to dig through the back and forth of why more police are in communities of color, kind of beyond that, because that's where the crime is answer? So
actually, if you were just go right into and just Google any of them, I mean, I do a lot of the reading on it. If you look at one, social disorganization theory tells you when you have systems in place that are healthy and thriving, like education, economic systems, political systems, residents, housing, communities, when you have all of these things in place, faith-based, not-for-profits, and they're healthy, regardless of the demographics of that community, they do well. When you remove those systems, regardless of the demographics, if you look at Ralph Sampson's stuff, that community declines very quickly, right? So it declines very quickly. But if you're really just starting out on any of these books about policing and things like that, look at some historians that don't get a whole lot of credit around the systems of policing. And an advocate that is just now coming back on the horizon is Ida B. Wells Barnett, and her advocacy around lynching and racial terror. Anything you want to look at, start with the concept of racial terror and slavery, and you will find some good books. Read things about, if you look at even White Rage, there's a section on Reconstruction, and you can see how policing was used in those times. There's books that I made our group read, Brown is the New White and Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, Dying of Whiteness. All of these things will start to talk to you about how policing has very much fashioned and formed from years ago, and then how it then has manifested itself today. Christina put it up there, yes.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Ethan, back to you.
Yes, I actually think I have two questions, but I'll start off with this one. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, because I know we were talking a lot of reform, restriction, restoration. I kind of wanted to throw another one in, reparations. I just wanted to know your thoughts on it, both in terms of the principle and the feasibility, because could we really expect reparations from a disease system?
So thank you. The first thing I always talk about when we talk about reparations is, let's define, what are we even attempting to repair? Half the time, repair assumes there was a healthy relationship to start with, right? So maybe reparations isn't the word we use, but how do we make people whole? How do we make people whole again? How do we make them healthy? How do we allow individuals to thrive in communities where they have been really oppressed for decades, centuries, 400, right? We know that 400 or so where we're trying to play catch up. So for me is maybe I always talk about reframing the language so that we can get to the desired outcome. The desired outcome for me is how do we make communities whole that we have, pillaged and decimated for, through colonization or for profit and capitalization? How do we do that? And particularly, how do we then even try and calculate the harm? If we were talking about it through economics, there are a lot of classes being taught now about the value, the dollar value of an enslaved laborer and what that would look like today. Right here in Charlottesville, UVA, they have the Enslaved Laborers Monument. Jefferson exists because of the slaves that were on his plantation. They call it grounds here and try and make it all sort of like, I'm like, no, it is not hallowed grounds. It is not, sanctified grounds. It is a campus like anything else. And when you elevate it to that level, you continue to degrade the people who were there, who built that place, who were not allowed on that place and weren't even allowed at that school. That's a whole nother conversation. But using even economies and modeling to start even to just look at what that picture would look like. But that also has to have conversations, because if I'm a descendant of a slave laborer, what is it that I might want? Will somebody ask me versus finally always telling me what they're going to give me and what it looks like for me? So there needs to be some truth in all of this, so that we can hear it. But do I believe there are ways in which we can reclaim, that disruption of their journey of those enslaved laborers? Absolutely, I do believe it. Years ago, I was, we were all terrified by kleppernomics with Dr. Klepper, God rest him. But we've got really healthy modeling abilities at Carnegie Mellon to help us reclaim that heritage, that skills, those abilities that was, stolen from a lot of people who look Black and brown and are indigenous, and not just for Black people. Let's start right from the beginning about here in the United States and across the world when people have been colonized for someone else's benefit. But that could be a project. I say work on it. I say pitch it, Ethan.
Thank you. I'll do my best. In that vein, I don't know if would I be able to ask a follow-up, Allie? Kind of
Quickly, you'll be the last one then.
Okay. Then I'll just ask a little bit more for you to speak about your idea of like kind of navigating these spaces, I guess, whether it be as a student or professionally, because a lot of the time, I guess in the sense I can say that I am a statistic, right? Even though I'm here at CMU, I do come from a background where I kind of fit into these papers and everything. And I feel like a lot of times many students or professionals don't really realize that, but we can't always go to HR. So I just kind of wanted to know what, like, your thoughts of kind of navigating CMU, the different police departments that you've been in, what have you. Thank you again.
So first, do it with boldness. You've got to do it with boldness. I am glad to say that I have a monthly conversation now with Provost Garrett. I have one. Let me tell you why we're having a conversation with him. After the whole incident about the map that had blacked out communities around Carnegie Mellon, that was a resource map that was given out that said, hey, here are these spaces and places and neighborhoods. I hit up the president and the provost with an email that said diversity, equity, and exclusion. I said, let me introduce myself to you, since according to your map, I don't even exist. So you've got to do it boldly. You have got to put yourself in those spaces and not allow someone to exclude you or to squelch your voice, your real voice, your authentic voice. Yes, I am a statistic, in every way. I mean, every demographic. If someone is looking for a paper version of, yes, we just hit the jackpot, they've got me when they start putting all of these check boxes beside it. And Ethan, I'm sure they have you and quite a few of other ones who are on this screen as well. But don't let them relegate you to a statistic. Be bold. Make your presence known. Start with something that you feel about. An email. You're right. HR is not the place to go at all. Go to who HR reports to. I didn't call HR and say, hey, listen, I'm really not happy with your map. I didn't call HR when I had some other pushbacks about appointments at Carnegie Mellon. I went straight to the top and said, if you're not willing to listen to me, I know there are plenty of platforms that will. And they'll listen to you because they don't want to be on the receiving end of that platform of your media. And they are really afraid of cancel culture. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but sometimes you can leverage it when there's some real good to be done.
Thank you so much again.
No, thank you.
And with that, we conclude our question and answer session, and I'm going to give the mic, as it were, back to Professor Camlet.
This hour went very quickly. There's so much more to say on these, but thank you so very much for your insights. Thank you for your extraordinary career, your activism, and your focus on Carnegie Mellon, both on our Washington campus and in doing events such as this. Please stay close because we have a lot to learn, and some of the issues that you are touching on are ones that I know that President Jahanian and Provost are both Provost Garrett are wishing to address and to move forward on. So thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Be well. Best on your educational endeavors. I'm so proud of my WSP students. I see you smiling, Sarah.
Be safe.
I see you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Al, you want to stay up for 1 second so we can touch base?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Professor Camlet, is that you asking us to stay on for a minute?
No, I just wanted to do some bookkeeping with Ali. I'm happy to have you stay on.